Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. This is a story of a long, winding, lifelong bicycle trip. And it starts with my wife's brother-in-law, Hilton Goodman, and we call him Hilty. And he was a Renaissance man. Hilty was a terrific musician. He played mandolin, played medieval songs on his mandolin. He played guitar, played jazz on his guitar. And he played a flute, and he played both kinds of music on his flute. He was just terrific. He was also a linguist. He was a professor of Romance languages at Rutgers University. As a young man, he served in World War II as a lieutenant, and he was the interpreter, the Italian interpreter for General Mark Clark, who was commander of the Fifth Army in the Italian campaign in World War II. Hilty spoke Italian, Portuguese, French, Spanish, as well as all different dialects in those different languages. And he spoke Yiddish because he grew up as a young Jewish guy in Philadelphia, and he learned Yiddish from his parents. And he was just a terrific guy. He could do the New York Times Sunday crossword in a matter of a few minutes. He was a very intelligent, very delightful man. And he used to come and visit us in Jackson Heights with his wife, who's my wife's sister. And he loved Jackson Heights because Jackson Heights was probably the most diverse zip code in the most diverse county, in the most diverse city, in the most diverse country in the world. And Hilty could walk down the main streets, the shopping streets at 37th Avenue or Roosevelt Avenue, and in a half hour's time, he'd be speaking 6 different languages to different people that he would engage on the street. It was just a wonderful thing to see. He was such an outgoing and wonderful guy, and people loved to talk, and he loved to talk in all these different languages. He also liked Jackson Heights for another reason, because Jackson Heights had handball courts. All the public parks have handball courts, which they have walls, which they don't have in New Jersey where he lived. And Hilty, to use the Yiddish term, was a starker. A starker is a big, strong, athletic guy in Yiddish. And Hilty competed on a national level in his age group, middle age and older, senior, in tennis, in rowing, which he picked up in Philadelphia, where he grew up near the Schuylkill River, which is a big rowing center, and in cycling on bicycles. And he was a terrific competitor and very good. He used to win medals all the time, and he was very, very healthy. But I used to tease him, and I said, all this healthy activity is going to kill you one day, because once he ended up in the hospital when he was run off the road by some teenage idiot in a car, and he was on his bicycle, and the guy deliberately cut him off and ran him off the road, and he got hurt and broke a few bones. And another time in New Jersey on a quiet lake, he's out there rowing in his small little racing scull, and he was attacked by a swan. Apparently, he was the mother swan because he was getting near the nest. He didn't know it, but he was approaching the nest where she had young swans, little baby swans. He was attacked by the swan. He got bitten, and all kinds of flap going on. And I used to tell him, Hilty, you better just lay on the couch and forget all of this exercise. It's going to kill you. And we used to have a running joke. I myself was a casual cyclist. I would ride around Queens. I had a Peugeot bike, a French bike. It was a mass-produced bike. It's kind of heavy. It didn't look heavy, but it was heavy. And I would ride around. And Hilty sometimes brought his bike to Queens, and we would ride around together. And in one particular instance, he said, I have an old friend from New Jersey who was working in New Jersey, and he opened up a shop here in Queens, and I'd like to take a ride and introduce you to him. He's a fascinating guy. He's a wonderful guy, and you might want to meet this guy. He's a really nice man. And that was good enough for me, so we took a ride to Astoria, where Hilty introduced me to Francisco Cuevas, who was his personal friend. And Francisco had a small shop in a storefront in a residential neighborhood in Astoria, where he made custom bicycle frames. And there is a market for that among enthusiasts. The general public doesn't really know that, but he made tailor-made to measure bicycle frames for enthusiasts at a special tubing. Is very, very light, and these are for racing people and touring people who were very enthusiastic about riding, and they wanted good stuff made to measure. And he had a little, what was a workshop studio there. And Francisco was a very nice man to meet. I was struck when I first met him because of his the way he looked. He looked remarkably like my paternal grandmother. He looked like he could be her brother almost. And he had the same face that she had. He had an open face with a real smile. He was a handsome guy, very bright eyes, and a nice demeanor. And he was probably in his early 70s at that time. And this was back in the mid 70s. He was probably in his early 70s. And he looked probably 15 years younger than he was. And I later on figured it out. He looked as bright and as young as he did, as youthful as he did, because he had spent his life doing something that he really loved to do. I once met Count Basie, and he had the same kind of a face. He was all lit up. He was in his 80s in a wheelchair, and he looked like a teenager because he had spent his life in music, which he loved so much. And it was very, very rewarding for him, as it was for Francisco Cuevas, apparently. He was a handsome guy, as I said, big smile. He was about my size, about 5'7", 5'8", and he spoke the Catalan Spanish dialect because he came from Barcelona, and it was fascinating to listen to him. He spoke pretty good English, passable English, but he favored Spanish. And it's funny, but I could understand the Catalan dialect pretty well because it was very close to the Sicilian dialect that all my grandparents spoke, and they all came from Palermo in Sicily. It was just a funny thing to hear it. In any event, I learned that he was born in Barcelona, Francisco, and when the Spanish Civil War broke out, this is a real curiosity. He ended up serving in both armies. He was impressed into the loyalist forces for General Franco, and he was also in the Republican forces. And at the end of I don't know how it happened. I never really got into the details, but I know he served on both sides of that war. And he ended up in a refugee camp. I mean, those were confusing times. And he ended up in a refugee camp. And after the war was over, he moved back to Barcelona. He got married. And he had his first child. They had their first child, Francisco Jr., who we called Paco. And the baby was sick. He had, not healthy, he had apparently some kind of early onset asthma. And the doctors told Francisco and his wife that, look, if you want to do the best thing for this child, get him away from the damp and cold, sometimes cold climate in Barcelona, which is on the Mediterranean. You have to move to a hot, dry climate where it's consistently hot and dry. Well, he was in the bicycle frame and repair business. He sold his little business, and he picked up his wife and his baby Paco, and they moved to Rosario in Argentina, which is in a hot, dry area in Argentina. And he started a new business over again, making frames, most of them for delivery bikes and stuff like that needed custom frames in Argentina. And he did bicycle repair. And he prospered over there. They had two more children, a son, Andres, and then a daughter, Maria. And he was making a living, in no great shakes, but he was living comfortably, and it was good until in the 70s, in the early 70s, the Argentine economy tanked. Argentina went into a steep depression, and they couldn't make a living there anymore. And he and his wife decided, we're going to move to the United States. And they moved to the New York area. I'm not so sure where exactly they settled, but he ended up with a job in New Jersey making custom frames at a shop called Paris Sport. It turns out that New Jersey was a hotbed of cycling activity, athletic activity, and Paris Sport was the number one shop in New Jersey. All the racers and tourists and all the bike enthusiasts would go to Paris Sport, which was owned by a Frenchman. And Francisco was the resident frame maker and repairer there for frames and stuff. And he built up a nice reputation and made a decent living. He was well paid, and he made a decent living and saved his money and decided to open up his own business and move to New York. So he did, and he moved to Astoria, which is when I met him after he had been in Astoria for a couple of years, and he was making a living, no great shakes, but he was supporting his family. They had a little house, and they were doing okay. I got to know him very well after that. I had an affinity, a natural affinity for him because he reminded me so much of my grandmother, who we used to say had golden hands. She was a dressmaker and she was an artisan. She made very, very fancy dresses for a big company all her life. And she was very, very talented with her hands. She could cook. Anything she could do with her hands, it turned out very well. And Francisco was the same way. He was a craftsman, an artisan. I saw him make these bikes, and I started to appreciate how good they were as compared to the mass processed bikes that everybody was riding around. His bikes at the joints and the tubing, it was like craftsmanship was like jewelry. It was finished. They were filed down. They were fancy, and they had cutouts and all sorts of things, and just beautiful, beautiful stuff. And the more I saw, the more impressed I was. And he was a terrific guy, and I became friendly with him. And we went. He invited me to join. He had a cycling group with his two sons, Paco and Andres, and his grandsons, Francisco and Diego. They were little kids, and about six other friends of his, most of them Latin American or Spanish guys. And we used to go out in Nassau County and the Queens border of Nassau County, park our cars, unload the bikes, and ride out in Nassau County along the Gold Coast, all different roads, very scenic in some of the rich, beautiful towns, lots of hills, and we would ride around. And I have to say that those days, riding with them on Sundays was some of the happiest days of my life. The companionship, the family, just the warmth and the enjoyment that we had was really, really terrific and was very, very good. And I became a real admirer of him and his craftsmanship. And I found out that all the tubing that he used for the bikes was made by Reynolds. There were two big tubing companies in the world. One of them was Columbus Tubing, and they're from Italy, and the other one was Reynolds in England. And these companies not only made bicycle tubing, they didn't make their fortune or their real money income from bicycle tubing, but they sold tubing for aircraft construction. And all the airliners in the world were built either with frames made from Columbus or Reynolds tubing. And he used only Reynolds. He preferred Reynolds. And they made the stuff with the new alloy. They sent out these frames with the new alloy he had ordered, and the instructions were very, very specific. They said this is such a light alloy. The only way you could put it together and basically fasten it together was by soldering it, which means you just use low heat with melted silver wire that you would use in the joints to attach the joints together. And you couldn't use anything else. You couldn't braze or weld the joints, which is stronger, but they both use high heat because the tubing company, Reynolds, said the tubing couldn't withstand that kind of heat. It would melt and damage or weaken the tubing itself. Well, Francisco ignored that, and he brazed a set of tubes into a frame. And he did it successfully, no problem, without damaging the tubes. And a salesman for Reynolds came around and saw it, and it says, "You're not supposed to braze this. You brazed this?" He says, "I don't believe it. You really did?" He says, "Yeah, I did." He said, "Okay." He says, "I'm going to tell you what. I'm going to send this back to the company because they say you can't braze it. Can I borrow this frame and send it back?" It was a sample anyway. He said, "Sure." He says, "And I'll get it right back for you." Well, the salesman sent the frame back to England, and the Reynolds Corporation engineers looked at it. And in response, they sent 3 engineers to Astoria, Queens, with a bunch of frames, tubes, for Francisco to braze in front of them as eyewitnesses because they didn't believe that he did it. And sure enough, he did it. When he finished with those 3 frames, he had 3 of his biggest fans now in the Cuevas fan club. They just worshipped him because he had such a deft and delicate touch with the torch that he developed over the course of his whole career, that he could braze those frames without damaging the tubing. And they, as a token of their appreciation, they offered and they asked him to join the Reynolds display at the New York Coliseum Bicycle Show, annual bicycle and trade show, as their honored guest. And they gave him free tubing for the rest of his life from Reynolds. And he was their star mechanic as far as they were concerned. They really enjoyed him and his company and his skill. And he used to always tell me, "Oh, you have to get rid of that Peugeot. You have to make a frame, Rudy. I'll make you a frame one day. You should get a frame from me, and you get a good frame and have a good bike because you're a good rider and you deserve a better frame than that. You should do that." I said, "Well, one day we'll do that, you know." But anyway, after a number of years of riding and everything else, I became such an admirer of his. I was inspired to write an article about him. I never did that before. And I said, okay, I wrote this article all about him, and I sent it to Bicycling Magazine, which is a national publication, the leading bicycling magazine in the United States. And surprisingly, they bought it, and they sent me a check for $600 and published it. And they gave me a co-author. I guess the guy was a professional writer on their staff, and they polished it up a little bit, and and put it in better order than I had it, etc. But there I am, a co-author of this article on Francisco Cuevas, and they sent a photographer and took some pictures of him making the frames, and it was very laudatory, and it gave him national notice and a national clientele. People started calling from California about making frames, and Oregon and Texas and you name it. Bicycle enthusiasts all over the world because of this, all over the country because of this one article that I wrote. And the rest of it was a rolling effect, sort of like an avalanche, because you find out that all of these publications, whether it be newspapers or magazines or anything else, everybody needs new material. And a number of magazine articles and newspaper articles came about because of that article, and people published their own articles. And then also he got notoriety on radio and in television. News shows came and did features on him, and et cetera, et cetera. And I helped him out with it. And he got a lot of notice and started becoming prosperous for once in his life. He was actually prospering, and it was really, really good. And this went on for a few years. And out of gratitude, after the first article was published, he made me a frame as a gift out of the best tubing and everything else. And it's a real work of art. Now, he and I and his son Andres are actually pretty much the same measurements. And it's a beautiful, beautiful frame. And he measured it to me, and I have it. And then you have to put the accessories that go on the frame, the pedals, the gears, the chain, the handlebars, the seat, you name it, has to go, the brakes, the cranks. You have to, the sprockets, you have to buy all of that stuff. And there's an Italian company, Campagnolo, and there's a Japanese company, Shimano, that makes that stuff. And they call it, from the Italian, they call it, when you buy the whole set, they call it a gruppo, which is a group. And Francisco says, Rudy, you have a frame. He says, you have to get a really good gruppo. I suggest Campagnolo, he says, because they're really the best in the world. The Japanese is technically very good, but the Italian stuff is older, and it's actually, my preference is for that stuff. He said, so my brother was playing, had a soccer match in Italy, and I had a list. I said, Robbie, go there, and there's a good bicycle shop near where you're going, and you can buy this. And you buy the Campagnolo top-of-the-line gruppo, called Campagnolo Super Record. And why was it Super Record? Because it's all made of titanium. It was the most expensive. And this was back in the early 80s. And I gave him the $600 from the article that I was paid for by Bicycling Magazine. And I said, if you need any more, lay it out, and I'll reimburse you. But he didn't. And he went there, and he bought everything that the list that the Cuevas family gave me to get. And he brought it all home, and we put it all together. And I still have the bike to this day and age, even in this day and age, and I've ridden thousands of miles on that bike. And the bike with that Campagnolo equipment, the titanium Super Record stuff, on that Cuevas frame I'm riding around the equivalent of a vintage Ferrari. And every time I show up where there are a lot of bicycle riders and enthusiasts, everybody stops to look at that Cuevas frame. And it's given me so much happiness in doing it. Well, as I said, Francisco prospered, and in his 80s, he now had enough money, and he decided he wanted to retire back in Barcelona. So he took his wife and his youngest child, which was Maria. She never got married, and they moved back to Barcelona where he was supposed to retire. And when he got back to Barcelona, he hooked up with all of his old friends that were still alive from his youth, from bicycle racing and the bicycle business. And his friends came to him and said, Francisco, you never told us how famous you are. And he said, "What are you talking about? Oh, come on, don't be modest. We know how famous you are." He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He said, "Oh, come on." I said, "Here, look at this." And they handed him a copy of the Spanish national bicycling magazine. Now, in Spain, cycling is big, and they have a national tour called La Vuelta. La Vuelta means the tour, and it's the same as the Tour de France or the Giro d'Italia. They're all the same. They're tours around the country. They're big races where all the top races in the world go. And I think the magazine was called La Vuelta, the tour. And what had happened, the Spanish magazine bought the rights to reprint the bicycling magazine that I had authored some years before. And in so doing, they also took a little literary license. Instead of proclaiming that Francisco was one of the best frame makers in the world, they said he was the best frame maker in the world because naturally he was Spanish and he was a homeboy, and they wanted to make him out to be the best in the world. And so these friends said, "Here, look at this. You're the best frame maker in the world and you never said anything to us." And he said, "Well, that's the magazine." He said, no. And the whole magazine article in the Spanish magazine came to the attention of the mayor of Barcelona, or was brought to his attention. I don't know how it actually happened. But he called Francisco to Barcelona City Hall, where he gave him a commendation, a proclamation from the city, and a grant, because the mayor said, "You have been a loyal son of Barcelona everywhere in the world. Where you went to South America, where you went to North America, you always had Barcelona in your heart. And the proof is that the emblem of Cuevas Custom Cycles was the same city official crest or coat of arms of the city of Barcelona." And that's what it was. It was red and yellow crest that represented Barcelona. And that was his corporate, logo for Cuevas Custom Cycles. I said, "And as a loyal son of Barcelona, we're going to give you this grant." And he had to open up the studio with the grant and teach young Spaniards how to make frames. So he did that for a few years in Spain, and he lived until he died at the age of, I think, his mid-90s. He was around 94 or 95 when he died, and he went there in his early 80s. And I don't know, do you believe in fairy tale endings? I don't know. But thanks to the power of the press, Francisco Cuevas lived happily ever after in Barcelona until he died in his mid-90s. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.